everybody, and welcome back to another episode of Keeping It Social. My name is Chris Salas, Assistant Professor of Social Work here at El Paso Community College and the host for this show. Again, the aim for this show is to bring light to some of the social issues impacting our community here in El Paso and the border region. No agenda, no politicized, no one-sided, just keeping it social, right? So in our last episode, we had Mr. Bernie Sargent on and discussed how we got to where we are, right? We talked a little about the creation and how things were back in the Old West here in what we now call El Paso. And there was a lot of topics that we touched on. If you have a chance, please take some time and go into the EPCC TV YouTube channel and check out not only previous recordings of this show, but other lineups within the EPCC TV programming. On today's show, again, I would like to welcome back Mr. Bernie Sargent. And today we're going to discuss on how the things that were present back in the Old West Texas town of El Paso might be present today, or how does it look like in today's world? So again, welcome back, Bernie.
Thanks,
how are
Chris.
you
Doing
today?
Great. How about yourself?
Doing well, thanks. So there's quite a few topics that we touched on in our first segment. Everything from, the different tribes that inhabited the El Paso region, right? The Paso del Norte region. You touched on how, in essence, the tribes lived in peace amongst not integration, but there was a lot of, we'll no integration, but we're at peace and we'll keep it civil per se, right?
Yes.
Keeping it social to keep the theme of the show. But obviously, when you have more than one group of people, there's always some sort of turmoil. And obviously, when we introduced the Spaniards, when we introduced the movement of even the Americans and the Anglos from east to west through Manifest Destiny and other ideations, well, we start introducing more variables. We start introducing more people into this mixture. And obviously, we know how it turned out. And in our last episode, we also ended with talking about how El Paso was never really, or let me rephrase that, we haven't always been a minority majority, right? It's never always been 80% Hispanic, right? We talked about how the KKK was present in El Paso at some point. We talked about, again, you even mentioned about the different ethnic groups and a lot of different countries of origins, from the Irish to Jewish, and people that inhabited this region. And they saw opportunity and they saw the potential for growth. And why not El Paso? Which, even now, why not El Paso? So has there really been a push? Has there really been a move? Has there been a change, I guess, is what I'm trying to ask, in our mentality when it comes to the involvement of different groups, right? Back then to now. And again, with a preface that when we talk about old El Paso, we're talking about the different tribes, and then maybe the introduction of the Spaniards, the Jewish, the Anglos from the East and such. Well, granted, we're not really introducing new people, but could we potentially be rehashing some of those instances of we're ruffling feathers with this introduction of other communities? The immigrant flow from Central America, even from Mexico, and even how our immigration policy favors some countries or some countries of origin over others. What do you think? What is your take on that in regards to how it was back then to where we stand now?
Well, in the previous episode, we talked a little bit about how things changed after 9/11, and it seemed that there was a pretty free-flowed area all the way up to the Mexican Revolution, when there was certain situations taking place across the river, the Battle of Juarez. it created some situations and some concerns that the folks on the north side of the river had to deal with, had to live with. And it was for a period of time after that open again, and then during World War I, it kind of closed down because there was a thought that the Germans and the Japanese were trying to influence Mexico, especially the Germans. And there was a very active program with the politicians in Mexico City and the Germans, because the Germans felt if they could seize a foothold, maybe not physically, but emotionally and ideologically, with the Mexicans, that would give them superiority over the Americans. And there was a very defined spy mechanism that took place. And there was a lot of money that exchanged hands from Germany to Mexico. And because of that, the borders again started to close up a little bit, more concern over the cross traffic. And that took place. Then after World War I died down, things were fairly copacetic all the way up to World War II. And once again, there was concern over German-Japanese influence on what was going on. The Japanese were looking for a port or some access to a port in the Northern Hemisphere. The Germans would just like to really have their ideology carried over to Mexico. And fortunately, the Mexican leadership, for the most part, was careful on their treading on that water, so to speak. They had gone through situations with Maximilian and all the European influence in the 1800s. They didn't want to have to deal with that again. But there was an attempt. So once again, the borders kind of got a little bit closed up. Then after World War II, they opened up again up until 9/11. And that's when things really changed. Right. Now, the influx of migration from not only Mexico and Central America, but South America and all over the world, what do they call them, OTMs, other than Mexicans that they report now, that number is growing substantially, folks coming in from Asia and Europe. And so there's a concern that, are these all people with good intent? So that's leaning on government. That's leaning on the leadership of our country and Mexico as to how to deal with that. It's a troubling time, and we have to kind of grapple with that and figure out how we're going to work through it. But fortunately, El Paso historically has been a melting pot, and that's been good because as people move in, whether it's from south, east, north, or west, the folks have kind of melded into the community of El Paso and become part of the community. I think what I saw and what I've seen in the past is there is a certain group of individuals that they would like the community to be like something else and not like El Paso. And that's where a lot of problems start to happen, when they want their mores, their ideologies to be prevalent and dominant, and they don't want to meld to become a community as one. They want to have a whole lot of little communities. That kind of goes back to what we had back with the Pre-Romanzo Antiguas, where he had all of these tribes setting up shop, so to speak, in areas, but kind of getting along and tolerating each other, but not melding. And I would hope and pray that the community does maintain that get along, melding attitude as we go forward, because we can learn from each other. I mean, there's a lot of things we can learn from the South. There's a lot of things that they can learn from the North, and we can all learn together.
Definitely. Yeah, and thank you for mentioning that. Yeah, we pride ourselves in our hospitality, and not many people know, but our official mascot's the Amigo Man, right? So even within our mascot, we're promoting the friendliness of El Paso and El Pasoense in general, which as a volunteer of the Sunbelt Association, I'm sure that you probably and the rest of the volunteers have heard it over and over again from people coming in from across the country for whatever team they're supporting. That's one thing that we hear across the board is, wow, El Paso is such a friendly city. Everybody in El Paso is such friendly
Absolutely.
people.
I mean, I've lived all over this country. Born in Pennsylvania, spent a lot of time in California, Arizona, Kansas, Washington. Been to almost every state in the United States, and without a doubt, I can say El Paso is one of the friendliest communities that I've ever lived or visited. Texas as a whole is much friendlier than other places I've lived. But El Paso certainly represents, or I should say, is a good representation of that Texas friendliness and open-heartedness.
Right. Yeah, we live up to our name, right?
Go.
Texas.
Absolutely.
Friend. I want to go back to something that you were talking about as far as, excuse me, during World War II, right? That the Germans were trying to, or let me rephrase this: Germany was trying to, in some way, infiltrate the ideals and the values, right, to the Mexico people, and thus put kind of infiltrate that into our military. And is that a good a summation of what you said?
They weren't trying to infiltrate. They were trying to keep us occupied. That's what they were trying to do. Especially World War I. They wanted the United States to be occupied with Mexico as opposed to going over and fighting in Europe. But during World War II, it was all about a means by which they could penetrate into the United States, because the eastern borders were being watched pretty close. The ocean, the Atlantic Ocean. But along the south and so on, it was sort of like how can we get Mexico to be on our side, because we want them to know that we can do things for them, that the United States is not going to do for them, and hence they'll be more welcoming to the German population. I wouldn't say as a whole, but the leadership over there, Hitler and his troops, they wanted to set up bases, I should say ports along there, in the event that they wanted to attack the United States from the south. That was in the back of their mind, as well as Japan, as I mentioned, also was looking at a way to have access to the northern hemisphere. Yeah. And so that those are the kind of things that the games they were playing, and it's interesting because a friend of mine, he's German. He was going to school at the University of Arizona, and for his thesis, he asked his professor. He said, "What should I write about?" He goes, "Why don't you write about the Mexican Revolution?" And he's going, "I'm from Germany," so, but he took it one step further. He goes, "Well, let me see what he heard stories about German influence on Mexico during the wars." So he actually went back to his homeland and studied and did research, looked up in papers, found articles written by the spy networks that were working with Mexico. Wow. And they also, by the way, had infiltrated the United States leadership. And so they had that going for them. But they particularly went into Mexico, as did the Russians. They did for a period of time try to influence the leadership in Mexico, but especially the Germans. And he found all kinds of information. He's written, I think, 4 books about that time period, about the German ploy or attempt with Mexico, and how they were using Mexico against the United States. It's fascinating.
Wow. That's interesting. When you were talking about that, it triggered something in my thoughts, and though it's not necessarily something that impacts El Paso in our region specifically, but obviously we know about the attempt of infiltrating our political system through social media, right? We talk about the spy bots, or I can't recall the name that's used for social media through either Instagram and Facebook and TikTok and such, by foreign governments. And so when you were telling me, or when you're discussing with myself and the audience about how Germany was trying to do that with the Mexican people, and in essence, like you said, keep the U.S. occupied and kind of avert our attention somewhere else, it in my mind at least, it made a connection, right? It made a bridge to, well, that kind of sounds like what we're going through now with social media and with technology. It's just much faster.
Yeah, that's
right? It's like you talked about that instant gratification, or that instant effect.
Fast now. It's just unbelievable. And I read. I'm a news junkie, and I like reading news. And what I like to do though is find out the backstory, because oftentimes you hear something on one of the networks and you go, "Wow," you want to react to it, but then you go, "Okay, what's the whole story?" It's like my wife and I were very fond of writing articles and writing stories. And I like to refer to it as the story between the pages. What really? Why did that person say that? Who? What motivated them to say that? Those kinds of things. What's the backstory? We always hear about Custer. We always hear about Washington. We always hear about all these famous people, about all kinds of folks. But why were they that way? What motivated them to move in that direction? What prompted them? What aspirations did they have beyond what we normally see in print? And that's the kind of thing that I like to research and write about, is between the pages. And just enjoy that. When we look at what was going on with Germany and Mexico, there was a lot of hanky-panky going on there. But fortunately, at that time, it took longer because you had the wire, you had the mail, you had to make the trips. Now you just get online and you just try to bury something in a story and send it to them.
Yeah,
it's amazing.
Yeah,
it's kind of scary.
Definitely, and it is. And I recall, I don't exactly remember where I read it. It might have just been passing, but I recall seeing or hearing somewhere where is it news or is it newsworthy?
Yeah.
Right? Is it going to bring, is it worthy of airing it on time, or airing or printing, or is there really some substance to it? So even that kind
that's missing in a lot of what's going on.
Right.
Substance.
Yeah. Right. But keeping it, not necessarily about politics and such, but now keeping with the military. Obviously now even in El Paso, Fort Bliss is a big staple in our community, right? You can't think of El Paso without our service members and our family members are here from Fort Bliss. And obviously we talk about the involvement from the beginning, like you said, it was just a post, right, where kind of the downtown area is now. And in essence growing to what is it, the second largest military base in the U.S.?
So, yes.
Yeah, now houses the 2nd Infantry or the 1st Cavalry.
I think it's first.
Major division. Yeah, the 1st Cavalry. And so obviously the involvement of the military has been, and the presence of the military has been something that goes hand in hand with El Paso, right? I recall hearing, I've been to some of these historic sites here in El Paso and gone through the tours with my family, and have heard about people sitting on top of what is now the Camino de Real Hotel, and sitting on the 10th floor and watching the Mexican Revolution take place right over the
standing
river.
On rail cars along the river.
And
the rail cars lined up. They were standing on those watching that. They would have picnics along the riverbank. I'm just going, to me, that's scary to me.
Right. Yeah. I mean, live action.
Sometimes too live. Yeah.
Right. But even now, right? We obviously the presence of the military and the rationale and the reason behind it being here in El Paso, that has changed, right? We're not sending off our military to go fight into Mexico and to go chase Pancho Villa as we talked about in the past. But it's definitely, I recall when I was in grade school, and even again and you alluded to 9/11, I was a senior at Burgess High School, and many people saying, after this event, the terroristic act of 9/11, a lot of people feared for El Paso because of Fort Bliss, right? That it could be a big target because of the military presence. And on the retrospect, as much as Fort Bliss is a part of El Paso and El Paso is a part of Fort Bliss, we also need to remember that not every base in the United States is open to the civilian population like Fort Bliss. And a lot of, or not a lot of times, in some instances, even dealing in my side through the social work and the counseling and therapy side of things, we do hear from some family members that there's a lack of security there, even as a military base. It's such an open base that people can come and go not as they please, but that it really isn't just solely for our service members, right? So obviously even the presence and the purpose for the military has changed. how do you see that as potentially impacting just the flow of the city in general? The integration of the military into El Paso from back then to now?
The role that it played, as you mentioned, has changed. It's changed a lot. I think on a plus side, the military, Fort Bliss, it's not that accessible. I mean, you just can't drive on. You've got to show ID and you have to have a purpose for being there. So there is a certain amount of security that does take place. Not like it used to be where they just wave you through. And I spent 3 years in the Army, but I was never at Fort Bliss. I was at Fort Hood, which at that time was, you just drive on post. Nobody would ever stop you. Things have changed, but the role of the military at Fort Bliss has changed significantly too. It's, I think it's, we call it strength through, respect through strength is what it's become. And a lot of these countries around the world, unfortunately, they only understand and they only pay attention if they feel you're strong. You don't have to be threatening, but they have to know that, I might not want to push that button too hard. And that is probably one of the significant roles of Fort Bliss, is they show we have a strength. On the plus side of what Fort Bliss can do for El Paso, I have met countless people over time that were stationed at Fort Bliss and they went back to El Paso when they got out because they loved it. So it has actually opened doors for El Paso as a community, as a civilian community, because of the Fort Bliss situation. So you look at Fort Bliss in the military vein, it is there for a purpose. Secondly, it provides a lot of jobs for civilians, which is good because you have a lot of military family, and they're working. They're teachers. They work in the stores. So it's supplying a labor base for El Paso, which is very important because El Paso, when you look at the way their situation is with taxing, for instance, this is on a different subject. El Paso residents pick up the larger share of the tax burden than the businesses do. And generally the communities, it's the other way around. And so property taxes hence have to be a little higher in El Paso to make up that difference. Well, you need people that can afford to pay the taxes. And those are the people that are employed. And a lot of Fort Bliss military families are employed. And a lot of military members are also employed off post. But again, it's been a welcoming situation for El Pasoans because they do bring people in. They bring people with talent in. And if you look at some of the entrepreneurs in El Paso that have set up shop in the last 20, 30 years, a lot of them are ex-military. And they saw an opportunity to not only start a business, but they could employ people. Maybe that business is supplying military weapons or military paraphernalia, something like that. Or it's a job that they saw in the military that needed to be addressed, like manufacturing printed circuit boards for computers, things like that. Using the UTEP and the EPCC students and their education to work with these folks in their businesses, and they're creating, again, a stream of income, a stream of tax revenue. Now, it's a very positive for El Paso.
Definitely, and I'm glad you alluded to that, because even the rationale behind our economic and our commerce and our commercial growth in the city not only has been spurred by the military, but as we alluded to, even that flow, right, that constant or that flow between the borders, which regardless of where you stand, right, that'll be another issue. But definitely there is that interconnectivity between Mexico, Ciudad Juárez, Chihuahua, and El Paso, Texas, the U.S., and even, if you incorporate Las Cruces, southern New Mexico, and just New Mexico as a whole, right, our three states, 3 cities, 2 nations. And so I'm really glad that you alluded to that, because the economic growth of the city almost goes as that flow between the 2 nations goes, right? And so, excuse me, even talking about the talent that is brought from the military, but even the labor force that you were talking to, right? And the type of labor that is available even in our region, right? That, and correct me if I'm wrong, but it really was a lot of agricultural, a large agricultural labor force that worked the fields, especially along the river. We don't have the high-tech jobs that some of the other cities have, but it could potentially be, like you said, that we might be behind the bar in some things, right? So maybe we're moving towards that, right? Maybe that labor market in other aspects, from the high tech to higher income jobs, maybe that's just right around the bend for El Paso, right? And like you said, maybe it's just taking us a little longer to get there.
I think El Paso's gone through stages of stumbling over themselves sometimes. We had a plentiful supply of telephone switchboard operators, telephone operators, that kind of thing. So that was the big push at one time for economic development. Let's bring in all these call centers. Well, they don't pay that well. They pay, they provide an income, but it's on the border of, you're going to have to draw some government money to subsist. So I think what's happening now, you're starting to see the gestation of more technical companies in El Paso realizing there is a talent in El Paso. It's not just, hello, can I help you? Yeah. It's people that they know how to do things, they know how to get things done. And that's a realization that I think even the leadership of El Paso is starting to grasp onto. And I saw that in the 35 years we lived there. It was starting to change. Because I would see these ads going, hey, we got all these jobs opening up for people answering phones. I went, nice, but we need to get high-tech jobs in there or more technical jobs in there and raise that up. And one of the, you alluded to the north-south transition of things with the maquilas. That has provided a real large opportunity for logistical firms, people that were moving product that came across the border and was going somewhere in the United States or Europe or somewhere. The logistical companies that would set up there on the border, a lot of jobs were created for that. And from that, there was a lot of technical know-how that was developed from those particular jobs. People needed to, you just don't want to stand there and hand count 5,000 washers. Let's find a better way to do that. So they devised the technical means by which to do that. So it spawns creativity, and one thing leads to another. I think so. That's been a good thing for El Paso. So as time goes on, I think that you're seeing that the leadership of chambers and so on, and we have many chambers, are starting to look at how can we attract people, realizing that El Pasoans, they can read and write. And they can do these jobs. We've got great institutions like the community college and UTEP and so on. And you can send me a check later. That's okay. It's an opportunity for EPCC to provide that talent to those people.
Definitely, yeah. You took the words right out of my mouth, and that's definitely an opportunity for us, not only at EPCC, but our fellow high institutions of higher learning, UTEP, NMSU, UACJ, right? Even across the border, to keep the talent that go through our doors and keep them here in El Paso, right? And see our city flourish, and really reach its highest, the potential that we all know it has.
Thing too, that doesn't get talked about very often. Our business, when we were living there, we had a business, we dealt with the maquilas in Juarez and Chihuahua. And what we saw was a growth of talent in Mexico. And it was spawned by the maquilas. We created a middle class. Up to that point, there was two. We created a middle class by putting jobs over there that demanded more technical expertise. And one of the things that the NAFTA agreements were directed to do is create this talent in Mexico, so that people would, like an American would go in there, they'd teach somebody how to be a purchasing agent, and that Mexican would take over the job and become that purchasing agent. So he's moving up the food chain also. And so he had all these things taking place in Mexico, in Juarez, and you're creating that particular enthusiasm and income availability that they before that didn't have.
Right. Wow. Well, again, Bernie, thank you very much for your time. I'm sure that we could probably make an entire series out of our conversation, but this is definitely quite the foundation for us to continue from here on out, and the great start for this show. So first and foremost, I'd like to thank you for your time and for sharing your expertise and your knowledge about our great city here in El Paso, from its humble origins to where we stand now, right? And even your insight as to where our city could potentially grow, and really helping us tie in how things were back then and how things are to how they could potentially be if, like you said, hopefully we don't go down the same path as we did in the past. We haven't, but I hope that's what continues to be the path.
Thank you, sir. Well, it was an honor to be the first participant on your program, and I wish you all the luck in the world.
Much appreciated. Thank you. And again, for our viewers, you are more than welcome to review and watch any of our previous episodes and our future episodes, along with the rest of the great programming that the EPCC TV staff puts on and my fellow faculty and colleagues strive to put out there for you. Feel free to go to the EPCC TV YouTube channel, excuse me, and access any of the previous recordings, again, at your convenience. If you have any questions, comments, or suggestions for future programming for myself, you are more than, you can send any emails to my email at Salas, S-A-L-A-S, the number 6, the number 9, at epcc.edu. Again, thank you for your time. And again, it's great to have conversations about these hard topics. Just remember, keep it social. Thank you, everybody.